Say one smart thing, and I'll invest $10 million. Ethan Caldwell didn't raise his voice, but the sentence cut clean through the soft jazz and clinking glasses like it owned the room. And in a place where a single dinner bill could match a year's salary, people listened when he spoke, especially when he was amused, especially when he was about to make an example out of someone. And tonight, that someone stood quietly beside table 12 holding a polished silver tray, her name tag catching just enough light to read Naomi Carter, though no one at the table bothered to look that closely, because to them she was part of the background, like the dim amber lighting or the skyline stretching across Manhattan's glass horizon, beautiful but irrelevant, present but not important. And yet Ethan leaned back in his chair, swirling a 12-year bourbon in a crystal glass worth more than most people's weekly paycheck, eyes locked on her with a smirk that had closed billion-dollar deals and crushed men twice his age, while the investors around him chuckled under their breath, already sensing the performance, already anticipating the harmless humiliation disguised as humor, because this was how power entertained itself, not loudly, not crudely, but precisely, like a chess player moving a piece he knew could never fight back. And Naomi didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't rush to laugh along or apologize for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. She just stood there, steady, shoulders relaxed, eyes clear, as if she had heard this tone before, as if she understood something the room didn't. The city lights reflecting faintly in her gaze while the air shifted almost imperceptibly, like the second before a storm decides whether to break or pass. And somewhere behind the polished confidence and tailored suits, a quiet tension began to form, unnoticed but real, because moments like this never stayed small, not when pride was involved, not when assumptions were about to be tested. And Ethan set his glass down with deliberate care, leaning forward just enough to make the moment feel intimate, controlled. "Go ahead," he added, voice smooth, almost generous. "What would you invest in if you were me?" And the table leaned in with him, smiles held just long enough to catch the reaction, expecting hesitation, expecting embarrassment, expecting confirmation of everything they already believed about a woman in her position, about who gets to speak and who doesn't, about who understands money and who simply carries plates. But Naomi didn't answer right away, not because she didn't know, but because she was measuring something, the way one might measure distance before stepping forward, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the tray, her breathing even, her silence stretching just long enough to make the laughter fade, just long enough to make someone at the far end of the table shift in their seat, because confidence has a sound, and so does its absence. And this silence wasn't empty. It was deliberate. It was controlled. And when she finally lifted her eyes to meet his, fully, directly, without hesitation, the room changed in a way no one could quite explain, as if the balance had shifted without permission, as if something unseen had just stepped into the spotlight. And then she spoke, her voice calm, unforced, carrying not across the room but through it. "If I were you," she said, "I'd stop assuming growth when your risk is already priced in." And just like that, the air didn't shatter, it didn't explode, it simply stopped, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention because it commands it. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell didn't smile. No one spoke, not because they did not understand, but because they understood too well, and that was far more dangerous, because in rooms like this, confusion could be dismissed, but clarity, especially when it came from the wrong person, forced people to confront something they would rather ignore. And one of the investors slowly set his glass down, the faint click against the marble table sounding louder than it should have, while another man leaned forward, brows tightening as if replaying her words in his head, breaking them apart, testing them, searching for the flaw that should have been there but was not. And across the table, Ethan Caldwell remained still, his fingers resting lightly against the rim of his glass, the confidence that once filled the space around him now replaced by something quieter, sharper, calculation, because he recognized the structure of what she had said, the language of risk, the precision of someone who did not guess, someone who knew. And that was not supposed to come from her, not here, not like this. And yet it had, clean and undeniable, slipping past ego and landing directly where it mattered. And for a brief moment, the illusion of control flickered, not gone, but challenged, And that was enough to shift everything, and one voice finally broke the silence. Low but urgent. Wait. The man said, turning toward Ethan. If the downside is already priced in, then the upside you are projecting is not real growth. It is just delayed exposure. And another voice followed. Quicker now, that means. The model is overestimating returns. And suddenly the table was no longer watching Naomi. They were looking at each other, at the documents, at the numbers they had trusted minutes ago without question, because power often depends on agreement. An agreement had just fractured, and Ethan exhaled slowly, not visibly shaken, not outwardly defensive, but no longer performing. His eyes shifting back to Naomi with a focus that was entirely different from before. This was not amusement. This was assessment, and he leaned forward again, slower this time, deliberate. Explain, he said, not as a command, not as a test, but as a request that carried weight, because now the room needed her answer. And Naomi did not rush. She did not step closer or try to claim attention. She simply spoke as if she had always been part of the conversation, as if the last 5 minutes had only corrected a misunderstanding. Your projection assumes market expansion at 8%, she said calmly, but your volatility index already reflects that expectation. So you are counting the same growth twice. And someone at the end of the table let out a quiet breath, the kind people make when they realize something obvious has been hiding in plain sight. And another investor shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. We missed that, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. And Ethan's gaze did not leave her, because now there was no denying it. This was not luck, not a guess, not a lucky sentence from someone out of place. This was structure, discipline, understanding, and it raised a question far more unsettling than the mistake itself. How had she seen it so quickly, and why had no one else? And the answer was not in the spreadsheets or the projections. It was standing in front of him, holding a tray, wearing a uniform that had convinced everyone in the room to underestimate her before she ever spoke. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell was not thinking about the deal. He was thinking about her, and the quiet realization settled in, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, that the most valuable insight in the room had not come from the most powerful person, and that changed the rules whether anyone was ready for it or not. The room did not return to normal. It shifted into something quieter, sharper, as if every word now carried weight that could not be ignored, and Ethan Caldwell leaned back slightly, not in dismissal but in recalibration, his mind moving faster than his expression revealed, because men like him did not lose control. They adjusted, they adapted, they found leverage even in moments that threatened their authority. But this was different. This was not a competitor across the table or a rival firm trying to outmaneuver him. This was a woman who had not even been part of the negotiation 5 minutes ago, and yet she had just altered the direction of an $800 million deal with a single sentence. And that kind of disruption did not fit neatly into his usual frameworks. And across the table, the investors were no longer hiding their reactions. One of them scrolling quickly through the financial projections on his tablet, another whispering to the CFO with a tone that carried urgency instead of confidence, because the foundation they had trusted was no longer stable. And when numbers start to feel uncertain, so does everything built on top of them. And Ethan finally spoke again, slower now, more precise. What else are we missing? He asked, not looking at the others, not seeking validation, but directing the question exactly where it needed to go. And Naomi did not hesitate this time, not because she was eager, but because hesitation was no longer necessary. The room had already crossed the line where her voice mattered. Your liquidity buffer is too thin for the timeline you are projecting, she said evenly. If the market tightens even slightly, you will not have enough flexibility to absorb the pressure. And a quiet tension rippled through the table again, because this was no longer a single oversight. This was a pattern, and patterns meant systemic risk. And one of the senior investors leaned back, rubbing his chin slowly. We assumed stability, he muttered, almost to himself, and Naomi's eyes did not waver. Stability is not a strategy, she replied, calm but firm, and that sentence landed differently. Not technical, not complex, but undeniable. The kind of truth that does not need explanation to be understood. And for a moment, no one moved, not because they were stunned, but because they were recalculating. adjusting their understanding of the situation in real time, and Ethan's gaze remained fixed on her, studying not just what she said but how she said it, the absence of hesitation, the absence of performance. There was no need for her to prove anything. She was not trying to impress the room, she was correcting it, and that distinction mattered more than any credential. And he leaned forward again, this time resting his forearms on the table, closing the distance not physically but strategically. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, his tone controlled but no longer dismissive. And Naomi paused for just a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty, but because the answer itself was simpler than the room expected. "By paying attention," she said, and a few quiet glances were exchanged around the table. Because that answer did not satisfy curiosity, it deepened it, and Ethan held her gaze, searching for something more, some indication of exaggeration or luck, but there was none, only clarity. And in that moment, something subtle but irreversible settled into the room. The recognition that status had misled them, that assumption had cost them, and that the person they had overlooked had seen more than all of them combined. And Ethan Caldwell, for the first time that evening, was not leading the conversation, he was following it, and he knew it. The question lingered in the air longer than expected, not because it was difficult, but because it had exposed something no one at that table was prepared to confront, and Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She simply stood there with the same quiet composure, as if the weight of the moment belonged to them, not her. And across the table, Ethan Caldwell leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled now, a posture he reserved for moments that required deeper analysis, not negotiation, because this was no longer about closing a deal. It was about understanding how he had nearly misread it entirely, and that realization did not come easily to someone who built his reputation on precision. And one of the younger analysts cleared his throat, hesitant but unable to hold back. "We ran this model through 3 different teams," he said, almost defensively. No one flagged that overlap, and Naomi's expression did not change, but her answer came with the same steady clarity. "Because everyone was looking for confirmation, not contradiction," she said, and the words settled into the room with a different kind of impact, quieter than before but deeper, because they did not just challenge the numbers, they challenged the mindset behind them. And a few heads lowered slightly, not in shame, but in recognition, because they knew she was right. They had been reinforcing each other's assumptions instead of questioning them. And in environments built on confidence, doubt often feels like weakness, even when it is necessary. And Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, as if a new variable had entered his calculations, one that did not fit traditional metrics, and he leaned forward again, his voice measured. "So you are saying the problem was not the data," he said. "It was the way we chose to read it." And Naomi gave a small nod, not dramatic, not triumphant, just precise. "Data does not lie," she replied. "But people choose what they want to see in it." And that sentence did not need elaboration, it carried its own weight, and one of the senior partners let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair as if the room itself had shifted beneath him. "We were too confident," he admitted quietly, and no one disagreed. Because confidence without challenge had just cost them clarity, and possibly far more. And Ethan remained silent for a moment, not because he lacked a response, but because he was recalibrating something deeper than the deal, something about perception, about judgment, about the invisible filters that had led him to underestimate the most insightful voice in the room. And when he finally spoke again, his tone had changed in a way that no one could ignore. It was no longer performative, no longer strategic in the usual sense. It was direct, almost surgical. "You are not just paying attention," he said, his gaze steady on her. "You understand the system." And Naomi did not smile, did not react in any way that suggested validation or pride. She simply answered, "I understand patterns." And that distinction mattered, because patterns were not tied to titles or positions. They were tied to observation, discipline, and the willingness to question what others accepted. And Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, then glanced briefly at the documents spread across the table. The numbers that had once felt certain now carrying a different weight. And in that moment, the hierarchy of the room had quietly rearranged itself, not officially, not visibly, but undeniably, because authority had shifted from assumption to insight. and Insight was now standing beside the table, holding a tray, waiting for no one's permission to be heard. No one reached for their drinks anymore, not because they had lost interest, but because something more important had taken hold of the room, something that could not be ignored or casually dismissed, and Ethan Caldwell slowly tapped his finger once against the table, a small motion, controlled, but deliberate, the kind of signal he used when making a decision that others would follow without question. And yet this time, the decision was not about closing the deal, it was about confronting the gap between what he believed and what had just been revealed, and he turned his head slightly toward his chief financial officer. "Recalculate the model," he said, calm but firm. "Remove the duplicated growth assumption and stress test the liquidity scenario she mentioned." And the CFO did not argue, did not hesitate, already moving to adjust the numbers, because when authority shifts, even subtly, the room feels it. And across the table, screens lit up, fingers moved, calculations ran again. But this time with a different lens, not one of confirmation, but one of scrutiny, and Naomi remained where she was, still, composed, not inserting herself further into the process, not claiming space that had not been given, because she did not need to. Her impact had already been made, and the investors leaned in closer to their screens. The quiet hum of recalculation replacing the earlier confidence that once filled the room, and within moments, the first reaction came, a sharp inhale from one of the analysts, followed by a low, almost disbelieving voice. "The margin drops by nearly 12%, he said, eyes fixed on the updated numbers, and another voice followed, "Tighter now, and the downside risk increases significantly if the market tightens even 2%. And the realization spread not as panic, but as clarity, the kind that strips away illusion and leaves only truth behind. And Ethan watched the shift without interrupting, absorbing it, confirming it, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a different kind of authority, not louder, not harsher, but more grounded. "If we had signed tonight," he said slowly, "we would have locked ourselves into a structure that looks strong on paper but collapses under pressure." And no one disagreed, because the numbers now spoke for themselves, and for a brief moment, the magnitude of what had just been avoided settled into the room, not dramatically, not with raised voices, but with a quiet understanding that the cost of that mistake would have been measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. And Ethan's gaze shifted back to Naomi, not with curiosity now, but with something closer to respect, measured, intentional, and he stood, not abruptly, not for effect, but because the moment required it, and when he did, the room followed, not physically, but in attention, because when a man like him stands, people notice, and he took a single step toward her, closing the distance that had once been defined by status and assumption, and for the first time that night, there was no trace of amusement in his expression, no trace of condescension, only clarity. "You just saved us from a very expensive mistake," he said, his voice steady. And the words did not feel like a compliment. They felt like an acknowledgement, and Naomi did not react with surprise or pride. She simply met his gaze, as she had from the beginning, and replied with the same calm tone. "You asked." And that was all. No elaboration, no performance, just truth. And something in that simplicity shifted the final piece of the moment into place, because it made clear that this had never been about proving herself. It had been about answering a question honestly. And Ethan held her gaze for a second longer before giving a slight nod, not exaggerated, not public, but real, and in a room built on power. That nod carried more weight than anything that had been said before, because it marked the moment where assumption ended and recognition began. The acknowledgement did not end the moment, it deepened it, because recognition from someone like Ethan Caldwell was not casual. It carried implication, it created direction. And as he straightened slightly, his attention did not drift back to the deal or the investors. It stayed on Naomi, deliberate, focused, as if he had just discovered a variable he had not accounted for, and was now recalculating everything around it. And the room felt that shift immediately. Conversations paused before they could begin, side glances redirected, because whatever happened next would not follow the script they had all expected when the evening began, and Ethan spoke again. Not louder, but with a clarity that held the room in place. "What is your name?" he asked, not because he had not seen it, but because this time he wanted to hear it from her, and Naomi answered without hesitation. Naomi Carter, her voice steady, unchanged, as if the weight of the room had not altered her presence at all, and he nodded once, absorbing it, not as a formality, but as a detail that mattered now. Naomi, he repeated, testing the name with the same precision he applied to numbers, and there was a brief pause, the kind that separates instinct from decision, and then he continued. You said you understand patterns, and she met his gaze again. Yes, she replied simply, and Ethan's expression shifted slightly, not softer, but more open, more engaged. Then tell me this, he said. If you were structuring this deal from the beginning, how would you do it? Differently. And the question landed with a different weight than the first, not a joke, not a test, but an invitation, and several heads turned sharply toward her, because now the stakes had changed. This was no longer about identifying a mistake. It was about redefining the entire approach, and Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she was mapping the problem, the way someone does when they see the full picture instead of isolated parts, and the silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It was expectant, charged with attention instead of judgment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm authority. I would start by separating projected growth from structural stability, she said. Build the foundation to survive contraction before you plan expansion. And a few of the investors exchanged quick glances, recognizing the shift in thinking, because it reversed the order they had all assumed was correct, and she continued without raising her tone. Then I would create flexibility in your liquidity position, not just as a buffer, but as leverage, so you can move when others are forced to hold. And the CFO's fingers paused over his tablet for a brief second, as if recalibrating in real time, and Ethan did not interrupt, did not challenge. He listened, fully, because now every word carried potential value, and Naomi finished simply, and I would question every assumption that feels too certain. And that final line did not echo loudly, but it settled deeply, because it did not just apply to the deal. It applied to everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes, and Ethan held her gaze, the silence returning for just a moment. But this time it was not about shock. It was about recognition, and he gave a small nod again, slower than before, more deliberate, because this was no longer about a single insight. It was about a mindset he had overlooked, and in a room where certainty had once ruled, a new standard had quietly taken its place, one built not on status, but on clarity, and Naomi Carter stood at the center of it without ever asking to be there. The room did not feel like a negotiation anymore. It felt like a recalibration of everything that had been assumed before Naomi spoke, and the investors who once leaned back in effortless confidence were now leaning forward with intent, not because they were trying to impress, but because they were trying to understand, and Ethan Caldwell remained standing for a moment longer before slowly taking his seat again, not out of habit, but as a signal that the dynamic had shifted from performance to substance, and he glanced briefly at his team, not to lead them, but to measure how far they had followed, and it was clear they had, because the tone around the table had changed from agreement to inquiry, from certainty to precision, and one of the senior partners spoke again, this time without hesitation. If we restructure based on that logic, we would need to delay the expansion phase by at least 2 quarters, he said, his voice thoughtful rather than resistant, and another added quickly. But that would strengthen our position if the market tightens. We would have room to maneuver while others are constrained. And Naomi listened without interrupting, not inserting herself into their conclusions, because she did not need to guide them step by step. She had already shifted the direction, and now they were aligning to it. And Ethan observed this quietly, recognizing something deeper than a corrected model. He was watching influence take hold without force, authority without title, and that was far more valuable than any single insight, and he turned his attention back to her once more, his tone now carrying a level of respect that no one in the room could mistake. You see beyond the immediate outcome, he said. You are thinking in terms of positioning, not just profit. And Naomi gave a slight nod. Short-term success means nothing if it creates long-term exposure, she replied. And the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any complex projection on the table, because it reframed the entire purpose of the deal. And one of the younger analysts looked up from his screen, almost surprised. We have been optimizing for speed, he said, not stability. And Ethan's gaze did not shift from Naomi as he responded. And speed without stability is just risk disguised as progress. And that acknowledgement, spoken in his voice, solidified the shift in the room, because now the lesson was no longer coming from her alone. It was being reinforced at the highest level. And for a moment, there was a quiet alignment, not forced, not negotiated, but understood. And Naomi remained still, her presence unchanged, as if none of this altered who she was or why she spoke. And that was what made it undeniable, because she was not adapting to the room was adapting to her. And Ethan finally allowed a faint, controlled smile to return, not the one from earlier, not the one built on amusement, but one grounded in recognition. You know, he said slowly, most people in this room have spent years learning how to speak with confidence. And he paused briefly, his eyes steady. But you speak with clarity. And the distinction settled quietly, because confidence could be performed, but clarity could not. And for the first time that night, the value in the room was no longer measured by titles, portfolios, or net worth. It was measured by understanding, and Naomi Carter had just redefined that without ever asking for the floor. The conversation did not end where most conversations would have. It expanded, not louder, not faster, but deeper, as if the room itself had realized it was no longer operating at the same level it started with. And Ethan Caldwell rested his hands lightly on the table, his posture composed but no longer guarded, because there was nothing left to defend, only something to understand. And he glanced briefly at the skyline beyond the glass, the city stretching wide and restless, a reminder that markets moved whether people were ready or not. And when his attention returned to Naomi, it carried a different weight. Not curiosity, not evaluation, but intention. You are not just identifying risk, he said, his voice steady. You are anticipating behavior. And Naomi did not correct him, but she refined it, as she had all night. Risk is behavior, she replied. Numbers only reflected after it is already happening. And a quiet shift moved through the table again, because that perspective did not belong to spreadsheets. It belonged to understanding people, decisions, pressure, the invisible forces that turned projections into reality or failure. And one of the investors leaned forward, almost involuntarily. That is not something you learn from models, he said, more statement than question, and Naomi's expression remained calm, grounded. No, she said. You learn it from watching what people do when they think no one is paying attention. And that answer did not just explain her insight. It revealed it, because it meant she had been observing not just numbers, but environments, conversations, reactions, the subtle signals others ignored. And Ethan absorbed that in silence for a moment, the implications unfolding beyond the deal in front of him. Because someone who could read behavior could read markets, could read negotiations, could read decisions before they were made. And that was not common, not even in rooms filled with expertise. And he exhaled. Slowly, not as a release, but as a reset. And then he asked the question that shifted the moment once more. Where have you applied this before? He said, not demanding credentials, but seeking context. And Naomi paused briefly, not because she was uncertain, but because the truth was simpler than the room expected. Here, she answered. And a few confused glances flickered across the table, and she continued, her tone unchanged. Every night, different conversations, different deals, different people, but the same patterns, and the simplicity of it carried a weight that no resume could replicate, because it meant her understanding had not been taught in controlled environments. It had been built in real time, unfiltered, consistent, and tested against reality. And Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition of something rare, something that could not be easily categorized or replaced. And he leaned back just enough to see the entire room again. The investors, the analysts, the data spread across the table, all of it now reframed by what had just been revealed. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet finality, not dramatic, but decisive. We are not closing this deal tonight, he said, and no one objected, not because they lacked opinion, but because the reasoning was clear. The foundation had changed, and decisions built on outdated assumptions no longer held. Wait. And he turned back to Naomi one more time, not as a performer addressing an audience, but as a leader acknowledging value. You did not just change the numbers, he said. You changed the outcome. And Naomi held his gaze for a brief moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of something simpler, something that had been true from the beginning, that clarity, when spoken, does not need permission to matter, and in a room that once measured worth by position, that truth now stood undeniable. No one rushed to leave, even after the decision had been made, because something about the moment held them there, not by obligation, but by realization, and Ethan Caldwell remained seated for a second longer than necessary, his gaze drifting once more across the table, the documents, the screens, the people who had entered the evening certain and were now leaving changed, not defeated, but recalibrated. And when he finally stood, it was not to reclaim control, but to close a chapter that had unfolded differently than anyone expected, and he adjusted his jacket with a small, habitual motion, then looked at Naomi Carter again, not as someone outside the system, but as someone who had seen through it, and that distinction mattered more than anything that had been said, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the value of what had happened did not require immediate words, it required understanding, and the investors began to gather their things slowly, not with the casual confidence from earlier, but with a quiet respect for the correction they had just witnessed, and one of them paused briefly near Naomi, offering a small nod, not performative, but genuine, before moving on, because acknowledgement had replaced assumption, and that shift, once made, could not be undone, and Ethan took a step closer, not to dominate the space, but to meet it on equal terms, and his voice, when he spoke, carried none of the earlier edge, only clarity. Most people spend years trying to be heard in rooms like this, he said. You did it in a few minutes without asking. And Naomi's response came with the same calm precision that had defined the entire night. I did not need to be heard, she said. I needed to be accurate. And the simplicity of that answer settled deeper than any compliment could have, because it revealed a principle, not a performance, and Ethan gave a slight nod, slower this time, more deliberate, as if marking the moment for what it truly was, not an interruption, not an anomaly, but a correction that should have happened sooner, and he reached into his jacket pocket, not dramatically, not for effect, but with intention, and placed a simple business card on the table beside her, not sliding it across, not pushing it forward, just setting it there, as an option, not an offer forced into the moment. If you ever decide you want a different table, he said, you will not need to ask twice. And there was no pressure in his tone, no expectation, only recognition of value. And Naomi glanced at the card briefly, then back at him, her expression unchanged, steady, grounded, and she gave a small nod, not acceptance, not refusal, but acknowledgement, because the decision, like everything else that night, would be made on her terms. And Ethan held her gaze for one final second before stepping back, not turning away from her, but allowing the moment to close without forcing it further. And as the room gradually returned to motion, conversations beginning again, footsteps moving toward the exit, the city lights still glowing beyond the glass, something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, invisible to those who were not paying attention, but undeniable to those who were, because power had not been taken, it had been redefined, not by volume, not by position, but by clarity, and in a world that often mistook confidence for truth, Naomi Carter had reminded them of something far more important, that truth does not need a title to be recognized, it only needs the courage to be spoken, and that night, she did not raise her voice, she raised the standard.